Welcome to the TTA Spotlight series on educational theory. So lots of people obviously know me for reasons other than educational theory, because I do a lot of other things with TTA, and lots of those things are fairly dull at times, or things like compliance checks and regulation checks. But actually, educational theory is something I'm really very interested in, have been interested in for a while, and I've been very pleased and delighted to work with a couple of people here actually on producing CPD content and resources on educational theory. So hopefully you will find it useful. The structure of today, we're going to try and give you a whistle-stop tour of most of educational theory in the last 80 years, which is rather ambitious for an hour, given that people do entire multi-year degree courses to cover this. So please bear with me in that it will be slightly abridged, and there will be parts of it which we might go over fairly quickly. But the main areas I want to go through are, first of all, classical educational theory. This is what most people who have done any kind of teaching qualification will have probably heard of. So we're going to go through Bloom's taxonomy, behaviorism, and constructivism. Most of those are quite well known. Hopefully some of you will know something about those. It doesn't matter if you don't, we'll give you a brief overview. Then we're going to go through some neuromyths. I always like going through neuromyths because unfortunately in this world, some people still believe it. It's like, I don't know, believing in the Easter Bunny coming to give you special presents at Easter time or something. But neuromyths is something which unfortunately is still on some university courses out there, and so they deserve to get a bit of attention just to explain why they are mythological rather than worth basing any practice on. And then we're going to go through some elements of modern education theory. This is stuff which is really only come to the fore in education in the last 10 or 20 years, and something which we'll try and focus more of our time on. So what we'll do is for each one of these, we'll do a 2 or 3 minutes on what they are, a brief overview. Then there'll be an opportunity to ask any questions, give any thoughts, and then we'll move on to the next one quite quickly, and we'll try and spend most of our time on modern educational theory towards the end. So we'll try and go for the first parts fairly quickly. So if you have questions, when I get to the end of a certain bit, there'll be a chance to ask questions. Hopefully that works for everyone. So without too much further ado, let's get started. So classical educational theory. What we're referring to here is the stuff which has been taught for a long time, and more or less was produced between the 50s and the 70s. And there's obviously a lot out there, but we're only going to focus on 3. The first thing we're going to focus on is Bloom's taxonomy. So lots of people will have heard of Bloom's taxonomy. Even if you don't work in education specifically, people have still heard of Bloom's taxonomy. So it's actually fairly aged now. This was come up with by Benjamin Bloom in 1956. To put it in perspective, this is not far off when DNA was first discovered. So if you imagine how much the rest of science has come on since then, the fact that this still gets pride of place on lots of teaching qualifications, well, it says something about the progress, I suppose, in teaching qualification development. But this is quite an old idea, but it's not necessarily a bad one. So it classified learning according to levels of cognitive function. So very, very simply, if you just simply can remember a piece of information that you've been told, like the date of the Battle of Hastings or something, you know it's to say 1066, then that's the lowest level of cognitive function. It then goes up into higher levels of cognitive function. So there's understanding why the Battle of Hastings took place. There's being able to apply it, maybe being able to explain what would have happened if someone had made a certain decision. There's being able to analyze it, look at reasons in more detail, and then evaluate. And then at the top of this, there's create, or sometimes it's labeled as self-actualization, whatever the hell that's supposed to mean. I've never quite understood exactly what self-actualization is, and I'm sure someone's probably spent a long time on a university course trying to work it out. But the idea is that there are these different levels of cognitive function. It is true that obviously it is much more straightforward to simply recall information than it is to analyze reasons for why that took place at that particular time. But one thing that people often mistake is that this was not intended to be a value judgment. Benjamin Bloom wasn't saying that remembering things was bad. And in 1956, remembering things was pretty much the cornerstone of the entire education system. So I think it's more clear that what Benjamin Bloom was trying to do was to encourage a variety rather than trying to say everyone must get to creating something brand new. I mean, creating something in the context of the Battle of Hastings doesn't necessarily make an enormous amount of intellectual sense. I mean, you can't create the whole process from the start again, can you? So it's not to say that remembering things is bad. So if you've ever done a course on Bloom's taxonomy and it's ended with don't get anyone to do the bottom stuff, only focus on the top, well, I think personally they're missing the point. So the idea is that there's different levels of cognitive function, and not one is not better than the other. So just be aware that when you're trying to use this in teaching practice, don't get too hung up on it. The most important thing really is to vary the sorts of questions you're asking students. So you're not only asking them to do questions that have a particular cognitive demand. And in particular, Benjamin Bloom's criticism of the 1950s was that very often teachers would just ask factual recall questions. And he was trying to encourage teachers to maybe ask a broader variety of questions rather than just what's the date of this, what's 7 times 5, and etc. etc. Try and go beyond that, which nowadays is very common, but back in the 50s perhaps was not so much. Any questions on Bloom's taxonomy before we whiz forward? Everyone probably has heard of this, right? Not completely brand new to anyone, I imagine. Okay, so behaviorism. Behaviorism is an idea that's come up by, well, it's elaborated on by a guy called B.F. Skinner. And there's two elements to this, really. One is about respondent behaviors. Respondent behaviors is how people associate a neutral stimulus with some kind of conditioned response. So this is the classic example of this is classical conditioning with Pavlov's dogs. The dogs heard a bell and people brought out food. Therefore, the dogs associated the bell with food coming. And therefore, when the bell was rung, they would start salivating before any food turned up because they expected the food was going to follow. So it's a neutral stimulus. The bell didn't actually mean anything for the dogs beforehand, right? Before they went through this conditioning process, they didn't care about bells. And afterwards, after that process of classical conditioning, the dogs associated the bell with the food. Now, obviously, this can happen in lots of human environments. There's lots of things that we see and then associate with certain people or certain conditions. You might see a person have an experience, so they're always a bit grumpy, and therefore when you see them, you're expecting them to be grumpy. I suppose it's the same kind of thing. The other aspect of this is operant conditioning, and this is what people have obviously known about for a long time. When I tell you about reward and punishment, obviously reward and punishment has been existent in human civilization for pretty much forever. But B.F. Skinner elaborated on it and explained it in psychological terms. Not necessarily for the first time, but he was one of the people to do it most extensively. So in a nutshell, this is about rewarding behaviors that you want, either by giving people things that they want or by taking away things they don't want, and punishing behaviors you don't want. And obviously this has been used in classrooms and teaching settings forever, pretty much. We praise students. Praise is a form of reward because it gives them validation that you're happy with them, and people like people to be happy with them. You praise students when they do things well, and you give them some form of mild chastisement, or perhaps more severe chastisement if it's merited, if they don't do what you want them to do. And this has been maligned over the years. People have sort of imagined that this is a call to go back to corporal punishment and beating students black and blue if they don't do as they're told every day. But that wasn't really what B.F. Skinner was trying to get at. He was more trying to explain the principles, the psychological principles behind what's actually been going on pretty much for all of time. So behaviorism is not untrue. Reward and punishment has an effect. If you reward someone every day for doing something a certain way, they will keep doing it that way. And if you punish people, then they're more likely to not do it. But it's not the entire story, and it certainly is not the entire picture when it comes to learning. You can encourage people to learn by using operant conditioning, but someone's not going to turn into a world-renowned physicist just simply because you've got the cane out every day. And that wasn't really what B.F. Skinner meant either. So I think it's a bit unfair for people to sometimes people do give behaviorism a bad reputation because they've misinterpreted it as being very overly obsessed about reward and punishment. Has anyone got any questions about behaviorism or any particular comment? Nope. Okay, quite straightforward, I suppose. The last of the classical educational theories we're going to just gloss over quickly is constructivism. And constructivism was produced in the 60s and 70s by a guy called Jean Piaget. And one of the things that Piaget postulated as part of constructivism was that students construct new knowledge, hence the name of the theory, by integrating it with prior knowledge. And an innovative part of what he was suggesting was that prior knowledge didn't just include things that were taught in a classroom. Obviously, there was a point at which students weren't ever in a classroom before, because they've been very young children, haven't been in formal education environments before. So Piaget was encouraging people to also place a value on play and unstructured learning that provided the initial framework that students have before they come to a formal learning environment. So this was perhaps one of the more innovative aspects of constructivism, where Piaget was stretching the definition of education and learning back towards things that weren't traditionally called education and learning. If you go back 150 years, most people in the mid to late 19th century thought that children below the age of 5 or something, when they were playing, that was just nonsense. It had nothing to do with education for them. They thought it was completely worthless, and one day we'll go and take them to a proper school and teach them proper things. Obviously, in reality, students were learning something, whatever it was they were learning, when they were playing and when they were doing whatever it was they were doing, up to the age where they then went to a formal education environment. And this is what Piaget really got people to start thinking about in the 60s and 70s, that actually there was value, cognitive development value, in what children were doing at a much younger age. This is kind of, you can say, a bit of an introduction to sort of early years education. Now, two of the key ideas in constructivism are assimilation and accommodation. And actually, very interestingly, we are going to come on to this when we talk about scheme theory in a minute. So assimilation is about taking new knowledge, new information, I suppose, before it's knowledge, it's information, new information, and integrating it into our existing knowledge. So students may have played with toys, and then you might say, oh, that's a toy aeroplane. Do you know what an aeroplane is? Or do you know different types of airplanes? And then they can start associating new information that you tell them to the information they already have. So that's the principle of assimilation. You basically anchor a new piece of information to something that people already know about. And then there's accommodation, and accommodation is about adapting what your prior knowledge is in response to new information that maybe doesn't entirely agree. So some students, for example, might grow up thinking that plants need soil to grow because every plant they've ever seen has been growing in soil. And then you introduce them to the concept of hydroponics, where plants can grow and their roots are in some nutrient solution. And they're very confused at first because they're thinking there's no soil. How is the plant able to grow? And they just see all these roots in a bag of liquid, and they just don't understand how this is possible. And then you have to explain to them, actually, what the soil was doing, we're doing by some other means. So we don't need to, if we're providing support to the plant, then obviously it doesn't need soil to provide the support. And if the nutrients are available in the solution, then perhaps the plant's got available nutrients from some other means. And then students can accommodate that and work out, okay, well, maybe soil is not magic on its own. Maybe actually there's something else. The reason why plants can grow in soil is because the soil naturally provides things that the plants need, and it's possible to replace that and do it in a different way. So that's constructivism. Has anyone got any particular questions about constructivism before we move swiftly onwards, or any particular comment? Nope. Okay, great. Right. Now, the last point to go through on constructivism is that sometimes this has been misinterpreted, and people have thought that people have used constructivism as a justification for more progressive learning strategies, where they think that the student must only go off and learn by being given complete freedom to go off and make mistakes for themselves. Now, if you take this to its absurd conclusion, you can imagine that you can basically send students off to try and learn the sum total of human knowledge all by themselves. Now, I mean, they might be bright, but that's probably a bit of a tough ask. Say, like, go off and write Principia Mathematica on your own when you're only like 11 or something. The average 11-year-old is going to very much struggle to come up with all of Newton's ideas on light and maths and all the rest of it. We are going to need to provide some kind of information to students. This is not the idea that you can just take students, they go off and rediscover everything for themselves. Okay, in a limited number of circumstances with a lot of structure and a lot of guidance, students can discover things for themselves, of course, but it's hardly the most efficient way to go about an entire education program. And so whilst there is sometimes justification in giving students a bit of a free rein to work something out for themselves, rather than just providing them with everything, we do want to be conscious of the fact that that can't take place all the time. And it has to be structured still. right? We don't want them just to be set off into the wide world on their own without any guidance. Right. Moving swiftly on, we're going to go through some neuromyths. These are quite fun, actually, because most of them are quite laughable and they have absolutely no basis in fact whatsoever in some cases. Or in one case was just a footnote at the end of someone's paper and it's been taken wildly out of context. So let's go through these. First of all, learning styles. Has anyone heard of learning styles? Learning styles are very commonly taught on a variety of education training programs. Usually we're referring to VAK learning styles, which stands for visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. Now, the principle behind learning styles is that all students or all people learn better in one of these three modes. So it encourages people to think of themselves as either a visual learner or as an auditory learner or as a kinesthetic learner. And it says, well, if you're a visual learner, you will learn best by looking at things. So here's a diagram and here's a picture and here's a video. And if you're a kinesthetic learner, you need to make models out of Play-Doh or something, or run around and pretend you're a molecule or something like this. Now, there are actually people that have come up with a whole cottage industry of learning styles, and you're word smart, you're this smart, or you've got up to 50, 60, 70 of these learning styles. But the big problem is none of them are substantiated by any evidence as to whether they actually work in practice or as to whether there's any reason to believe that this might exist at all in the first place. So if we look at practical evidence, when people have done studies on trying to identify people's learning styles and then teach them only using that learning style versus teaching people in a different learning style, when you try and control for other factors like the clarity of the information provided and all these other things, which actually is quite difficult to do, you don't find any real impact from teaching people in accordance with what their learning style is supposed to be. So that's a problem. But on the other side of it, there's no theoretical reason why learning styles would exist at all. When we've done brain scans on people of all different ages, students, adults, and everything else, people don't have brains rewired in three fundamentally different ways. That just doesn't exist. People tend to be more visual because we're all primates. We're all part of a family of animals which have through evolution focused on visual stimulus as the main means of making use of opportunities and threats. And so we're all primarily visual in most senses and capable of taking auditory stimulus and kinesthetic stimulus. Now, what has often happened in many schools and teaching environments is actually the students that are achieving well are deemed to be the visual ones. Oh, they read all the books and they look at all the things that we've provided to them, all the worksheets, which are all visual stimulus, and therefore they're doing really well because we've provided them lots of visual stimuli. And the students that are doing badly or behind tend to be labeled as kinesthetic students. And there has been, in some cases, regrettably, I've seen this firsthand, a trend sometimes in schools in the past to say, well, these are the children that are doing badly, therefore you must teach them using the kinesthetic learning style. And it becomes this laughable nonsense where you end up going in with Play-Doh to try and teach students, poor students that don't really know what they're doing. You're trying to teach them some sort of element of GCSE science using Play-Doh, and it just doesn't work. So VAK and any of its sort of similar analogs are of very, very limited value, if of any value at all. So I wouldn't suggest that you try and use these to base any of your educational practice on. Anyone got any funny anecdotes or sad anecdotes about VAK or learning styles? You do still see these things pop up on the internet. Good heavens. I wish they'd go away.
In the early years of my career, we had to put it on all lesson plans, how we were catering for visual, auditory, and kinesthetic.
Oh my good heavens. Kinesthetic learning styles in Latin. What do you do? Play-Doh numbers, Play-Doh letters or something?
Yeah, it really was nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously no practical way of getting some sort of benefit out of a kinesthetic learning style when you're teaching someone a language. I don't think it just becomes a tortuous method of trying to entertain theorists. Anyway, moving swiftly on.
See, I still completely disagree, though. I think I'm a visual learner.
Everyone's a visual learner, Sam.
No,
Unless
but
you're blind, I
I
suppose.
can watch. So if you demonstrated something to me that I've never done before, I could watch you once or twice and then I could replicate it. So like
Yeah.
videos, I would watch videos on how to, I don't know, create this magnificent cake spectacular, and then I would go and bake it and decorate it, and it would look pretty good.
Yes, and your prior knowledge in relation to cakes and your motivation to get it right are both very, very high, which is a useful useful benefit. I mean, look, everyone is capable of doing all these things, right? There are differences. There are subtle differences, but the idea that there's 3 fundamental different ways in which someone's brain is wired just doesn't stack up. So yeah, I agree, Sam. You are a visual learner, but then that doesn't mean anybody else isn't a visual learner. But they might not be motivated enough to focus on something. Whereas I know from personal experience, sometimes you're very motivated to do something, you'll definitely get it right. But yeah, I think everyone can do all of these things, and in different circumstances, they'll all be important. But we shouldn't try and just use learning styles for their own sake, especially where there's no real logical reason to try and do it. So we'll move swiftly on. Now we're going to look at Dale's code of experience. So this is the principle that you remember 10% of what you read, 20% of what you hear, 30% of what you see, and so on. And if you teach something or say and do it combined or however else, the bottom one gets described in different ways. And sometimes this is all put the other way around as well, sometimes where the pyramid goes up. But in either permutation, it's a complete myth. First of all, the idea that any scientific experiment would give you numbers quite so neat as this is complete nonsense. Nothing in science that I've ever seen has ever worked that way, with perhaps 1 or 2 very, very simple exceptions, like Hooke's law in physics, where it's literally a law of physics that the force equals the extension, is directly proportional to the extension. In this case, with something as messy as psychology, there is absolutely no chance that memory and retention is some round multiple of 10 that varies depending solely on the method in which you've delivered it. It's also manifestly untrue because if I ask you to explain the plot of your favorite book that you've ever read, the idea that you'll only remember 10% of the plot is just nonsense. You could quite happily read a really good book and remember most of what was in it. I'm not asking you to remember every single word. That's not what we're really assessing. But if we said, do you understand what's happened in this book? Who are the characters? What are their features? Who's done what? Who did this? Who murdered so-and-so? Then you're going to understand. If you were interested and you read the book, you would know. And likewise, just because I've taught something, I mean, okay, teaching something or saying and doing it together, you probably can't do that for very long if you don't actually know what it is already. So really, it's not about the teaching helping you to remember so much, although it will have an effect of doing that as well. But you can't teach something if you don't already know it, in which case you're saying, well, if you've already retained it, then of course you've retained it. I mean, it's kind of a tautological statement. So there are differences in what we remember, but it's not principally down to whether we've read it, heard it, or seen it. And in particular, some of the most profound impacts on retention come from having very strong emotive stimuli. So if you see something extremely shocking, so for example, if you was unlucky enough to see someone being severely injured or killed, you're very, very likely to remember that event in great detail because it's a major emotive shock. A lot of what you see in everyday life does not merit that kind of level of attention. And so most of what you see in everyday life, you'll not notice at all. If I ask you to describe a room that you were in yesterday, assuming it wasn't the same one as the one you're in now, you might struggle to find and to pinpoint any of the details from that room. It's not because you weren't there, but you weren't paying attention to the different features of that room, and therefore you didn't retain any of that information. So attention and motivation tend to be much more important factors in determining retention of information than simply the mode in which it was delivered. Any questions about Dale's code of experience? Has anyone seen this before? Some people have seen it. Yeah. I wish you could unsee it, but it was actually just this was the one which was a footnote from his from a study he did in the 40s, and actually I'm pretty sure it was put down as sort of an idea, like, do we think this might be right? And it's sort of put in as a diagram to sort of see, like, as a throwing it out there, and it was put in the conclusion of a paper that was actually on something else. People then seized on that diagram, which just turned out to be his sort of thinking on the back of a fag packet, and seized on it, and is still talking about it in degree programs ever since. I mean, good heavens, it's bizarre that that's even happened, but there we go. Anyway, moving swiftly on. Oh, this one. Didn't they make a film about this? So, the myth that you only use 10% of your brain is quite widespread, and it's debatable as to where it comes from. Some people claim it comes from one particular scientist or another, Einstein or someone else. The point is, it alleges that you're only using some small percentage, normally about 10% of your brain, and that if you were to unlock more of your brain and to use more of your brain, you'd be able to achieve wonderful outcomes. You'd be much, much cleverer. You'd be able to do amazingly well on every single test. You would have greater intelligence or whatever else that is being claimed. Now, this is complete nonsense. There is no reason to believe that people only use some small fraction of their brain. There are some reasons why this might have come about, but it's also been very widely used or misused by people to sell any kind of product or service that claims to increase the proportion of your brain that you can use. Yeah. So there are a whole range of things I've personally seen in my life where people have said, oh, buy this brain training game, we'll unlock some percentage of your brain, or go through this brain training program with some super consultant and he will help you or she will help you unlock some extra percentage of your brain. And all of this is obviously rubbish. Now, a much more useful analogy with regard to a brain is probably a bit more like a company. So a company employs lots and lots of different people. And if we imagine a company that makes baked beans, for example, actually a very small number of people in the company actually stand there in the factory making baked beans. Most people in the company do something else. They either drive trucks to deliver the ingredients. They are engineers that maintain machines. They are people that work in HR. They're people that work in the executive team, the executive team's assistants, finance, all the other people that are involved in a company to produce anything. The number of people that are actually making baked beans probably is only about 10% or probably even less. And this is much more similar to how the brain actually works. There's different parts of your brain, obviously specialized and adapted to do different things. And any particular task is not going to need everything in your brain to do it. If you want to move your finger and raise it into the air, that only requires a very small proportion of your brain. And it doesn't matter how much more of your brain you could or would try to use, it won't make that task any easier to fulfill. And the same is obviously true of academic activities as well. If you're trying to do a maths test, there's parts of your brain which simply don't have any role to play. So the parts of your brain that control gross motor movement aren't going to be applicable when you're comes to solving a quadratic equation. So there was a film on this, wasn't there, once? I couldn't bear to watch it. It just caused me too much pain to imagine the idea of watching this ridiculous film where, I don't know, someone managed to turn their body into lava or something by using 100% of their brain. Such how someone managed to raise money to make a film like that, I don't know. But anyway, Hollywood does some weird things. Has anyone heard of this? Some people have heard of it. Yeah. I hope you ignore it from now on. Okay, so that covers, as I promised, all of the whistle-stop tour of classical educational theory and neuromyths in the first half of the session. So the second half, I wanted to spend a bit more time on things that theoretically, at least, actually work and have some practicable use in teaching contexts. So we're going to focus on two main things, which I think make the most sense. And they are schema theory and cognitive load theory. And I will try my best to ensure that I can explain for you how they actually have a direct practical benefit on day-to-day teaching practice, because educational theory can get a lot of bogged down in talking about sitting in ivory towers and all sorts of interesting ideas about how people learn, and then you go away and you realize, oh goodness me, I've got to teach Bob on Monday morning and I have no idea how any of this stuff applies to him. So I will do my best to try and see if we can make it relevant to an actual practical chalk-face teaching and tutoring. So schema theory. Schema theory is the idea that your information that you've retained in your memory is stored as rich, dense networks of things that are related to each other. So in this particular example, we have a house. A house is a concept, a place where you live, and it has certain features that you would expect to find of a house. Now, your schema of a house may be different to anybody else's based on your experience. Someone who's grown up in a foreign country where all houses are made of wood, they will naturally presume that a feature of a house is that it's made of wood. Whereas people living in the United Kingdom probably would think that typically houses are made of bricks, because that's the sorts of houses they've probably seen most of the time. Now, there will be a number of links that you'll have. You'll be able to recognize a house from what it looks like. You'll be able to recognize what the rooms in a typical house would normally be. You'd understand what its function is. You'd understand what it's made of. There's all these things which if I were to ask you about your particular house or a particular house, you'd be able to quite easily handle and explain and discuss. Okay. And there are things that you expect where if they weren't as you expected, your interest would immediately be aroused. So if I was to tell you there's a house, but it has no doors, immediately you would be quite surprised. You'd immediately be thinking, goodness knows, how are people going to get in? So schemata, which is the plural of schema, refers to how different schemata can be linked in various different ways. So obviously all of the concepts which link to a house on their own, you will have some information about them. For example, you will know that windows are made of glass, and you may know something else about glass. You may know that glass is made from sand. You may have a schemata that's glass on its own is a concept which you will have related information to. Now, where does schema theory come into teaching and teaching practice? The idea is that, before we go on to this, the idea is that you can learn new information by assimilating it into your existing schema. And if you go back to constructivism, this is where Piaget was probably very much along the right lines. And so this is an extension and a more modern elaboration of that kind of idea. If you were to learn more about glass, it has to be linked to what you already know. So the prior knowledge that Piaget was talking about. And then you can learn, okay, glass is made of sand, the chemical structure, the chemical properties of the sand and the different additives can change what the color is going to be and this, that, and the other. And you could learn a lot more about glass, which is a fascinating subject all by itself. So that's schema theory. Anyone got any questions at this stage? Or is this new to anyone? Or is it people understand it or someone's seen it before? There's some nodding, which I'm presuming means people are happy. And no one seems to have an urgent question. So we'll move forward to the task. So I'm going to show you 6 sequences of symbols. Don't write them down. Certainly don't screenshot it, otherwise that's cheating. But I want you to try and memorize all 6 sequences. Okay. And if you were to memorize all of them, you should win a prize. Okay. Here are the 6 sequences. You've got 1 minute to memorize them all. Obviously, this is the most exciting part of the recording. So anyone that's watching me back recorded, I hope you're still trying to memorize them yourself. Right, time is up. So I hope all of the geniuses present are able to now write them down. Now, this is a really fun activity to try and do. If you think you can write down all 6 sequences, please go ahead and do it. And then we can discuss why some of them are a bit trickier than others.
I've had 3 children, John. There's just no chance that.
Yeah, I think using children as an excuse is great. I've got a few children myself, and I can't do all of them. But yeah, it is quite tricky. Have you at least got one of them?
I've tried for 3.
There we go. See, and the first 3 generally people are quite confident about. Then it gets a lot harder very quickly. And the last sequence, I mean, a lot of people will immediately try and see if they can remember the last sequence, and it's extremely difficult. Is anyone still trying, or would like me to leave them for a minute, or are we all happy to have a look at the answers again? Yeah, we're going to look at the answers then. Right. Who got the first sequence? Yeah, everyone. It's really easy, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Now, that's really straightforward because it's just the numbers 1 to 9. So, no problem. Who got the second sequence? Who can tell me what the second sequence is? So anyone, just to come off mute and say it.
Fisherman.
Fisherman. Now, the interesting thing is, you don't turn around and say Fisherman. You'd say it's a word that you recognize, and so you immediately just say the word. It's a sound that you recognize, and it's part of a schema which relates to what they do, what you'd expect them to look like, you expect them to be on a boat, you expect them to have a fishing rod, and all these other things. Who got the third sequence? Yeah, the third one, not too bad. Most people can get that. Okay. What's the third sequence? Anyone tell me? Anna, you're on mute.
Yeah, I got the OTTFFSSEN.
Oh, you got that one?
Yeah.
But did you get the other one next to it?
The KJ, I only managed to get 4 letters in that. The rest of it was hopeless. And the last one, just a few.
Now, with the third one here, Salawadak, it actually is a nonsense word. It doesn't mean anything in any language, as far as I'm aware. But you can say it, and so you can try and link it to a sound, and then you can try and decode the sound phonetically and say, oh, Salawadak, and you know what letter makes the sound S, etc., etc. The OTTFFSSEN is actually the first letter of the numbers 1 to 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So if you knew the code, it would be easy. If you don't know the code, it's a bit harder because you have to try and just remember the sequence of letters by some other means. Now, obviously, when we get to the random sequence of letters that doesn't make any sound, has no apparent link to anything, it gets a lot harder because now there's no way of encoding and decoding the sequence. And then when we get to the last series of symbols, you don't even know probably what these symbols are. One of them looks like it's Chinese. One of them looks like it's Sanskrit or something. One of them looks like it's Arabic. One of them is just a box with a cross in. And this doesn't seem to make any sense to anything. You can't even give a label to each symbol, let alone, I mean, at least with the KJSP, you know that the letter K is code for a sequence of lines. Mary's got a point here. Let me just have a quick look in the chat. I was told that memory works in 3, so e.g. phone numbers, remember, is 3. But so this is interesting because memory, working memory, has a capacity of about 4 units. Now, that's why when we're trying to remember things that we've never sort of seen before and we can't encode as a single unit, we try and chunk them into 3 or 4 units. Now, often people try and do it as 3 units because it gives you a bit of spare working memory capacity to try and manipulate things. So it's a much, much easier thing to try and group things. Chunking, it's actually called chunking, into chunks 3 or 4 chunks maximum so that you can try and remember a larger amount of information. So if you can group the letters K, J, S together and remember them as a single unit, P, E, Q, Z, L, A, you've got a better chance of getting it right than if you try and remember each letter independently. Yeah. So this just goes to show how important some level of prior knowledge is in adding in information easily. I don't doubt that all of you could memorize the last sequence of symbols if you were given enough time, but you'd probably want to give each symbol a name that you could remember, and then you'd have to learn the shape of that particular symbol, just in the same way that when you were a child, you learned the shape of all the letters and the shape of all the numbers. Okay, so it's still possible to do it, and there are people who learn Chinese and Japanese and learn thousands and thousands of characters, but they assign meaning to all of those characters, and those characters are well embedded into a network of existing information, which is why they make sense. And there have no doubt been people out there that have memorized the entire Bible and all things like this, or 10,000 Buddhist prayers. And they do this because they link these things as part of a broader schemata and lots of networks of related information, so that you can use some part of the network to help to decode other parts that you may have struggled to remember. And so this is why schema theory is really important. It's really important if we're teaching people things, we try and link it to as much of what they already remember as possible. So whether it's languages, whether it's academic subjects like science, English, or maths, we're always trying to link the new things we're trying to teach to stuff that they already know. So obviously that was very difficult to replicate because there were some elements of that which you had no prior knowledge or experience of, and therefore very little hope in a minute of trying to come up with off the top of your head. Now, we're going to move on to cognitive load theory, which is the second sort of main area of modern educational theory. And this is very much about how much strain we're putting our cognitive part of our brain under at a given point in time when we're learning, and how much strain our students are under as well. So bear in mind what we've talked about with schema theory, because we're going to come back to a lot of that in just a moment. So cognitive load theory is predicated on the fact that working memory has a very limited capacity. Working memory only stores around 4 chunks of information at a time. And that means that anything in excess of that will overload our working memory, and we're going to struggle. To avoid overloading our working memory, we need to be conscious of what those chunks are going to be and what the links that we want to make between them. There are 3 main forms of cognitive load that have been suggested. The first is the intrinsic cognitive load, which relates to how complicated a piece of new material is to a student. Some things are intrinsically not that cognitively intensive. So simple facts, especially where they're related to things that students would know something about anyway, they don't have a very high intrinsic load. Yeah. If you were trying to teach a young child, for example, what a pilot does, as long as they know what an aeroplane does and they can understand the principle of having a driver, it's not too difficult to imagine a pilot as a driver for an aeroplane. The intrinsic load there is relatively low. If you were trying to teach someone something which has lots of different variables involved, like the ideal gas law, there are several different variables which makes it much more difficult for people to understand and to manipulate that idea. So the intrinsic load is comparatively high. Extraneous load is cognitive load associated with the way we transmit the information to the person who's learning it. Now, in this context, I'm talking to you and showing you information on a screen that you need to read. Now, if you are good at reading English, the extraneous load here is relatively low because you can read the words that are on the screen and you can follow what I'm saying. If you cannot read English, the extraneous load for you is going to be a great deal higher. The extraneous load can be reduced by displaying and presenting information in a clearer format. So, for example, a simplified diagram. Rather than giving a really complicated diagram with everything on it all at once, you might provide a simpler diagram first, and then maybe you provide a slightly more complex version with extra components added later on. But extraneous load is specific to the person who's learning. And this is obviously where tuition has a major role to play, because we can be flexible and can tailor how we display information to a student based on what we know about their current level of knowledge and what they can do easily and what they will struggle to do. The last area of cognitive load is the one that people most often misunderstand. Germane cognitive load is the cognitive load associated with creating new links between pieces of information that are being manipulated within working memory. Let's go back to the example with a young child being taught what a pilot is. And they understand the principle of a driver, and they understand the principle of an aeroplane. So we would then be trying to get the child to link the idea that there could be a person. So a pilot is a person, and they already know what a person is. A person can be a driver, but in this context, rather than driving a car, they're driving an aeroplane. And so we're trying to make links between different ideas so that the child can learn a new job. A pilot is this kind of a job, okay? And they're creating links between the idea that, yes, I know a driver is a person, and yes, I know an airplane's a kind of vehicle, and yes, kinds of vehicles need someone to drive them, and a pilot is the name we're giving to the person who's driving an airplane. So in this way, we're actually using some of their working memory capacity to create links between things that they already know something about, even if they've never heard the word pilot before. So a quick recap. Cognitive load has three main components. One is the intrinsic load, principally determined by the complexity of the new information we're adding in. Two is the extraneous load, which is the cognitive load associated with the way in which we present the information. And three, the germane cognitive load is the cognitive load associated with creating links between different pieces of information, different schemata, or different chunks. So the key takeaway principle here is to limit how much unfamiliar material is presented at the same time, but we don't need to worry too much about how much familiar material we're asking them to call upon, because familiar material can be treated as one chunk, one concept, okay? We don't need to tell a child the driver is a person, because that's something they already know about drivers. They already know that drivers are people, yeah? We don't need to tell them, hopefully, what is an airplane. It's got wings, it flies in the sky, because hopefully they already understand that principle. They already know what an airplane is. They've seen toys, they've seen the real airplanes. The idea is we're limiting the new information. We're not telling them about different types of pilots flying different types of planes at the same time, because that would get too confusing too quickly, and would overload that working memory capacity. Now, does that make sense? Have I done a reasonably good job of limiting your cognitive load? Someone's putting thumbs up. So, has anyone first of all seen this before, well aware of this? This is kind of like a recap, but you know it? Or are there people thinking, hang on a minute, I've never seen this before, this is brand new?
I wouldn't say it's brand new, but I just definitely need a refresher of learning all of this. I've just learned some of this stuff such a long time ago. It's really helpful to refresh all my knowledge.
Yeah, great.
It's good.
Anyone else? This is new. Yeah. So hopefully this has got a lot of real practical applications in teaching, okay? Because you can easily consider how much of what I'm planning for this lesson, or at least this part of a lesson, because this is going to happen minute by minute, right? You might introduce some information to a student, give an explanation, ask them some questions, get some feedback as to whether they've understood it or not, do a bit more practice, and then you'll come and do something else. And you'll go through lots of little cycles of providing new information, testing to see if they've understood it, providing feedback, and then going back and doing something else. But it's a way of helping you to plan in your mind and to think consciously about how much new information am I giving them? Yeah. How much am I asking of them compared to what they already know and what they can already do? Obviously, there's got to be something new there, otherwise they're not going to learn anything. But there can't be too much that's new. Yeah. So if you want to teach them maybe, I don't know, 10 features of a cell, okay, maybe start with 3, get those 3 right, do another 3, and then maybe see if they can do the last couple. Yeah. Because you're then limiting the amount of new information. If they don't know anything about a cell, then maybe 10 features in one lesson is just too much. Yeah. There's nothing wrong in tuition with saying, look, the outcome that we want to achieve cannot be achieved in one lesson because it's too much new information. So we're going to do the first half of it really well. Much better to do half of something really well than to do all of it really badly. Because then you end up with students coming out completely bamboozled, and more or less you might as well have not bothered in the first place. Probably we've all experienced, I mean, I've certainly experienced instances in my teaching career where I've provided too much intrinsic information at once, and I've got lots of blank looks, or some blank looks from students and children afterwards, thinking, goodness knows what John was on about. But presumably we've all had that experience. So any questions about cognitive load? If it's new to you, I need to check you understand before I move on as well. I should hopefully practice what I preach. No questions? Marvelous. Well, for those of you watching the recording, although you won't get the chance to ask me questions directly live, you can go onto TTA's CPD platform where all of the content here is included. So if you want to get a refresher and then do some questions for yourself and practice for yourself, then you can do, all broken up into nice little chunks and individual pages. So if you want to go and refresh yourself on this, you can go back to TTA's CPD platform and you can access a lot of this information there as well. Right, we've got a few minutes left, so we've got a bit of time to go into some other educational principles which rely on a lot of the theory which we've just covered. Okay, so don't worry or panic about trying to memorize all this stuff, but these are teaching practices based on some of the theory we've just gone over. So the first one is the testing effect, retrieval practice. Okay, it's quite straightforward. We're asking students to retrieve information so they can A, demonstrate they know it, B, provide us with a good indication as to what they've remembered and perhaps what they've not remembered with things they've missed out. But this, really importantly, this strengthens their own schemata, because in order to retrieve something, they need to go back into their own schemata, and when you use those connections, you strengthen them. There's actually principles in neuroscience whereby we can actually see that neurons that fire together, wire together is the saying. Things where you keep practicing something, you get better at it. Now, this isn't going to be new to any of you, right? Yeah, of course, if you practice something, practice makes perfect. Everyone's heard that since they've been a small child. But this is really, really important, because as a teacher, as a tutor, we can very, very easily get into the habit of, oh, we need to provide more teaching. We need to do more. Or giving students things to do which don't actually force them to actually retrieve the information. Like, take this information and copy it into a nice, pretty picture. Well, that's great. But if they're just copying something from somewhere else, they don't actually have to remember it. So retrieval is really, really crucially important. And that's what helps to put things, get things assimilated into the schema, into a schemata, the networks of related information. So one very, very practical piece of advice and suggestion I would give to you is to go away, make sure you're asking your students lots of good questions, get them to retrieve a lot of the information you've been providing to them. Go back over information they've done previously, especially if it's relevant to what you're going to cover next. Because if they haven't remembered it, then they don't have the prior knowledge you're hoping they have. Make sense? Perfect. There's one very solid piece of practical advice based on educational theory. Second one, feedback. Providing good feedback to people is about identifying what have you missed in your answer. What was good about it? Obviously, we want to praise them. Remember, back to behaviorism, operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is still a real thing, whether or not behaviorism is popular or not. If you are praising them for doing something well, that is still important. That means that they're motivated to keep doing it in future, in principle. Also, what have they missed and what was incorrect? Now, I do not subscribe to the view that some people say of only ever tell people nice feedback. Sometimes people just need to be told that something they did was not correct. And sometimes being clear and straight to the point is a lot more effective for a student than beating around the bush with flowery language. because if they've not solved the equation correctly, they probably want to know. So feedback, make the feedback clear and specific, and ideally soon after they've actually done the task. So if you're in a tutorial, you can give them feedback immediately. That's great. That's ideal. In a classroom setting, it's very difficult to do that because you may have a lot of other students. You can't give them all feedback at the same time. In a tuition setting, there's no reason why you can't. And it's a fantastic idea to give them feedback straight away. And if they have got something wrong, obviously you're going to be polite with them, but be clear. Moving on from feedback, metacognition. Now, we don't really have enough time in 1 minute to explain metacognition. I can't do it justice in 1 minute, so I'm going to skip it. But metacognition is on the TTA's CPD platform. And if you'd like to learn more about metacognition, then we can cover it in a future date. Last one we'll do today before we close will be spaced learning and interleaving. Spaced learning and interleaving is about the principle that you can practice something at one point, or teach something and practice it at one point, and then you're going to do something else, and then you're going to come back to it in future. And this is really important. It's similar in a sense to the testing effect, except the testing effect is just about the principle that you need to get people to retrieve the information. Spaced learning and interleaving is about when you get them to retrieve the information, then you do something different and get them to retrieve that. And then you're going to come back to what you did the first time later, and then later again after that. So when, for example, people are doing flashcards and they've got the whole pack of flashcards for the key definitions of their course or something, it's that can be used to affect spaced learning. It can be used to provide spaced learning, because as you cover more content and add more definitions to the pile, as it were, you're keeping on going through the old ones at the same time. Yeah, you can use quizzing apps and all sorts of online platforms and things like this to do it as well. But the principle is the same, whether it's paper or whether it's digital. The idea is that you teach something and you rehearse it, you do the retrieval practice, and then at a later date, you do the retrieval practice again, provide the feedback, do any extra teaching that's required, and get that and do that practice again, so that you can interleave it between different pieces of information. People know that they can't just focus on one thing and forget about it, because all of it's interrelated, right? If we're suggesting that all of this information they need to remember is part of complex web of schemata, then we need to rely on those schemata to help us remember each individual part in the middle. Okay, any last questions? Has it been helpful? No one's booed me off the stage. I suppose I like delivering these things in person. It also means that you've got the added risk that if someone wants to throw tomatoes at you, then you're within range. But no, I'm glad if it's been useful and helpful for people. Hopefully it's been clear enough. We've tried to give a whistle-stop tour through quite a lot of different things. So hopefully it's something that's been interesting. A big thank you to all for coming, and also a big thank you for all of those of you who have been really helpful in the past in helping me to develop and refine this, both people on this call and elsewhere, because delivering this kind of stuff and talking about these kinds of things to people, the training gets better the more times it gets delivered and the more times you work with people and deliver it. So great. Well, thanks so much, everybody.